I have 20 minutes. For those of you who have heard me speak before, you know that's not possible. I am extremely fond of the sound of my own voice, and you are going to find that out. My major interest always was history. I wanted to be an archaeologist, and when I came down from the Okanagan, I was brought up in Summerland. I went to UBC. They didn't offer Egyptology, so I took classics. After getting a bachelor's degree, I realized that if I continued with that, I would be in school forever, and I didn't want that to happen. So I amalgamated my interest in history with my interest in what was accessible, which was vintage clothing. And I got ahead of the hippie rush just by a couple of years, so I got remarkable things in thrift stores truly for pennies. Out of that, I did develop a very comprehensive collection, so I'm very pleased with that, and it has turned into a career now. I was with the Vancouver Museum for 20 years, and I left 24 or 5 years ago now to devote myself just to the history of clothing. Clothing is the most intimate of all artifacts that survive. You wear the clothing you do because you think it suits the needs of your day, but also because it portrays the kind of character you are. It is a costume. I'm wearing a suit, so you think I know what I'm talking about. I have credibility. The tie helps as well. We tend to do this individually, but also society at any given moment will have rules and regulations about what's appropriate garments, so that people are reassured themselves about the kind of world that they live in. Nowadays, we are casual people, presumably. We're a very democratic society, so everyone sort of dresses the same. If anyone dresses up too much, especially in Vancouver, they're seen as pretentious, and God forbid that should happen. So anyway, I have brought two things today to talk to you about which describe clothing as artifacts. Museums are often really misinterpreted as art galleries. Art galleries are a different thing. It's about art. It's about beautiful objects or thought-provoking objects or what have you. Things that will create an emotional reaction in you. That's what art should do. Museums are essentially teaching institutions. If a museum isn't teaching, it's not doing its job. Teaching means stories. History is nothing but gossip, and we love gossip. So I'm going to gossip with you today. And we have two love stories that I'm going to describe to you. Now, I am going to be able to move because I have another microphone on me. So, this dress here, and I'm sorry, I apologize to the people in the back. You will not be able to see, but they'll be here afterwards. You can come and have a look. This dress, it's pale pink cotton, machine sewn, hand embroidered. I got this from one of my fairly close by neighbors. I had done a display at the Surrey Museum in Cloverdale, and I was approached by this couple. And this was the husband's grandmother's dress from her trousseau in Scotland, probably in about 1907. He didn't actually know the year. I have the wedding dress as well. It's typical for Art Nouveau fashion. It's all curving lines, and it's very soft. It's very exaggerated. She would have worn a corset. She would have padded her chest, padded her hips, and so on to create this form. It is objectifying. And fashion in 1900, 1910 was objectifying. It was the woman as the ornamental object. There's nothing wrong with being ornamental unless it's the only thing you are, in which case you should reevaluate your priorities and hope to expand into a few more horizons. You will hopefully get old. I was quite beautiful in my youth. My beauty is internal now, but there you go. We hope. So, the family, the husband and wife, were married in Scotland. They came to Canada in 1911, and they moved to a farm outside of Winnipeg, and they started their own farm on their newly turned land and this sort of stuff. In 1914, the First World War began, and he felt it was his duty to go back to Europe and participate in the war effort. So he left her behind on the farm with their two daughters by then. They had two little girls. So he went with the Canadian Armed Forces and went to Europe, was gassed twice and survived. And then she got a telegram from the ministry saying that he was missing in action and presumed dead. She was, of course, devastated. And in denial, she decided she would go to Europe and she would look for him. She took the 2 daughters and she placed them with the neighbors. And she went to Europe and she joined up with the Canadian Army as a singer, as an entertainer. And she went through the army bases and the field hospitals until she found him, and she did. She managed to get him to England and then back to the farm. Now you look at the dress differently. First, love story. Now this rather showy dress was worn in Winnipeg in about 1931. It's a wedding dress. At least we assume it's a wedding dress. It is a wedding dress. We know it's a wedding dress because there are codes. It's white. It's sort of useless, essentially. Wedding dresses tend to be impractical. That's part of the indulgence. It is white. It means it soils easily. It has three 10-foot trains. Conspicuous consumption. What was this woman up to? I mean, yippee, she finally got a man, I guess. Each of the trains is lined with pink net ruffles. It's silver metallic ribbon all over it and whatnot. Very, very, very glamorous. Very expensive. I got the dress from a family in North Vancouver. It had belonged to a great grandmother, not a great grandmother, a great aunt of one of the family. And they were a bit hesitant about telling me too much about the story, but we visited for a while. They had a scrapbook, and in that there was a photograph of the wedding. It was a newspaper clipping which had been glued right in, so they couldn't give it to me. And there was the bride and all of her bridesmaids. She had 6 bridesmaids, all done up like presents, and all obviously in different colors. It was a black and white photograph, but you could tell it was all in different colors, and massive bouquets and so on and so forth. So it was a big, lavish, expensive wedding. This was a joyful moment for her, obviously. They were married. She settled down, I suppose. And then a year later, she decided she was going to go south from Winnipeg down to St. Paul's, Minneapolis, to go shopping, she and a friend. The friend canceled, but she thought she would go on her own regardless. So she got in her car and she started for the border, and then realized it wasn't going to be much fun on her own. So she turned around, went back home, but on her way, she stopped at the home of one of her bridesmaids. Her husband was there. So she went home and she committed suicide. Now it's an artifact. It's not a dress. You look at that dress now differently. And that's what museums should do. That woman was disappointed. Her heart was broken. But she was also ashamed, because the rules and regulations of her world in 1930 essentially amounted to the fact that if a marriage broke down, it was the wife's fault. I had an aunt who was divorced in 1949, and she was a pariah in Summerland. She had 4 children. Every other woman in the city figured that she was looking for a new husband, so she was never asked to do anything. Dress or artifact. That's what museums need to do. And when we do exhibitions, that's what we aim for. We're producing an exhibition with the Macon House Museum in Millardville on women's clothing of the 1920s and 30s. We're doing fashion shows for SMOC, which is the organization that I'm with as an honorary curator, the Society for the Museum of Original Costume. We are trying to create a museum of clothing and textiles. Another example of this kind of reaction, I have a friend named Klaus Janke who collects German and Austrian clothing and fashion. With his clothing collection, we did an exhibition at the Holocaust Education Center here in Vancouver 15 years ago. And it was a discussion of the deterioration of the Jewish garment industry in Germany and Austria under fascism. People walked through the gallery looking at these beautiful pieces of clothing, crying. One of my greatest treasures is a beat-up, torn gray sweater that my friend Leonard McCann was given when he was in the Japanese prisoner of war camp in Manila during World War II, and it was a gift to him from the Canadian Red Cross. And I had visions of some farm wife in Saskatchewan knitting that sweater throughout the winter, and it being picked up by the Red Cross and working its way through to Manila. And Leonard kept that. Leonard's gone now. Leonard became the curator at the Vancouver Maritime Museum for many, many years. So, a happy story, a sad story, but both thought-provoking. And you were talking about First Nations people. In Canada, women were not legal persons, of course, until fairly recently, 100 years ago or so. Women in Canada got the right to vote for the first time in a federal election in 1917, provided they had a male family member overseas who was unable to vote for himself because he was in the military and at battle. Nothing horrible happened, and Canadians, we always do things very carefully. Nothing horrible happened. There were no conspicuous revolts or nobody died in Canada anyway. So the next year they changed the rules so any woman in Canada could vote in her own name, provided she was 35, owned property in her own name, and was Caucasian. Elitist, racist, and sexist. First Nations people, and people of color, as the term was used, could not vote in federal elections until the election in 1961. The first people who were here were the last people to be invited. So that's what history is for me. It is a constant lesson. And the truth is, if you do not remember the past, you are doomed to repeat it. And obviously, the people here are very, very conscious people. And it's people like you who can make a difference and truly make the Canadian dream, which we're lucky to have, come true. Every day, I am grateful for living here, especially here in Vancouver, but living in Canada and having the kind of life we do. I'm sure that's 20 minutes and probably more. My father was a preacher, by the way, in case you can't tell. So, Salvation Army at that, too. So, anyway. Okay, thank you very much. I'm so flattered to be asked to be here. Thank you, thank you.
Okay, let's ask this amazing font of experience and wisdom and wit some questions. Who wants to start us off?
Now I have to live up to that.
Yep.
One thing I forgot, if I may. The woman who went to France and found her husband, her name was Mrs. Tough.
Wow.
And it's spelled Tough. Not great. I'm sorry.
Happy Friday, Ivan. I first heard you speak at the Museum of Vancouver. You took us through a walkthrough during the Ravishing to Riches exhibit, and I was completely wowed.
Rationing to Ravishing, it was called. It was
Rationing
women's
to
clothing
Ravishing,
of the 1940s
yes.
and 50s, yes.
And so my question to you is, I'm just pondering, clothing has changed tremendously, and now we live in a time where, things are mass-produced and we dress for comfort. Do you feel, as a historian, will our clothes tell a story in 100 years from now? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm actually not a really good person to ask about that, but of course I have opinions. Many opinions, not much information. The truth is, because we live in a society where we are supposed to be equal, at least in theory we are. Our aristocracy now is the people with money, and actually in the old days it was money too, they just happened to have titles. But the truth is, we are supposed to be equal, so we dress in a way which is actually pretty unpretentious. For one thing, in history, it will always be the case, there are two options in fashion. Either the clothing will dictate the silhouette or the body will dictate the silhouette. Now it's the body. Those dresses, especially the pink one on the end, the dress is what creates the shape. The body is just a support for it, really. But the truth is now we dress modestly because anything beyond that, as I mentioned, is seen as pretentious. It's difficult to actually analyze what's going on because I always think of a woman trying to put her makeup on, or a man for that matter, I suppose, with his nose up against the mirror. You're too close to it. You have to have the perspective of time in order to understand it. And one of the things that is true in any given age is that there are so many variations. Everyone dresses, as I suggested as well, to describe their own identity. It links them to people of common thought. Somehow it means something. T-shirts with logos are the obvious illustration of that. But I absolutely think that current clothing will still be collectible 50 years from now. I don't want to collect it. I think it's as boring as can be. But for me, it's all about history, and I'm too close to it. Yes?
How do we know if garments from our own collections are worthy of...
Or you could go, Alana.
Well, he said yes.
Well, stop it. I'm playing Merv Griffin in this TV show.
Sorry.
How do we know if garments from our own collections are worthy of keeping and saving for future generations?
You phone me. No, if it means something to you, then it's important, and you should keep it. But museums are very, very fussy because you cannot save everything. Not everything is worth saving. I try to keep at least 3 of something. Once I have 3, then I can use the 4th thing in a fashion show or whatever. But if it's a totally rare object, or if it has an association with a personality or a political event or some aspect of technology that it's the first of or the best of, then you save it. And as a collector, you have to try to be broad-minded. You don't collect things because you like them. You collect them because they fill in a void in the picture. My collection in particular, the Society's collection as well, but my collection in particular is most valuable because it's been curated right from the beginning. I have disposed of things which are not terribly important, mostly because, especially in the old days, I had to eat. But the truth is that each aspect, when you put an outfit together, everything has to match, not just for the time period, but for the taste, for the social level of that person, for color and all those other things. So that's one of the reasons our shows are popular. I'd like to think they come to hear me, but the truth is they come to look at pretty dresses, and then once I've got them, I tell them things. But the outfits have to look real. They have to be credible, even when they're funny. Sometimes you'll see people in the street that are dressing for effect. That has its value. But is that necessarily something that's collectible? But you want that as well, because everybody is individual. Every garment. People ask me, what's my favorite piece of clothing or my favorite hat or whatever. And I say, all dresses are equal before God. As we are all equal before God, provided that there are gods and so on and so forth. Anyway, enough. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to follow. I wanted you to elaborate on something in the answer just previous. You mentioned both in that answer and in your talk about the ways in which fashion are forms of individual expression, and you touched on almost. You mentioned logos on T-shirts.
Yes.
I want you to give us your thoughts on when those logos are brands and the ubiquity of commercial branding on the clothing that people wear, and the ways in which contemporary society is willing to sublimate individual identity to the broader material culture?
Okay, this is opinion again, not knowledge. It's tribal to a degree. It's a question of trying to belong to a category of person who buys that garment, who wears that garment, the black leather jacket, Levi's, it's so many of the T-shirts are meant to be humorous, but some of them do make political statements. I have one that has Bill Vander Zalm on it that says you can take a politician to government, but you can't make him think. That sort of thing. And I kept it, obviously, because Mr. Vander Zalm had his followers, but also his detractors, and its local history, and so on and so forth. There is the term sheeple, sheeple, and maybe that's it. But some people need organization. They need membership. It makes them feel stronger, perhaps, but it also makes them feel less lonely, less isolated. I don't do that myself. I would buy a pair of jeans at the thrift store and take the brand name off the back because I didn't want to be a free advertisement for some company. But that in itself has pretense. I live off the drive. People on the drive want to think that Kerrisdale is pretentious. There is no pretense like the drive. So I think for those people who want that kind of membership, I think it's perfectly reasonable and it has value for them. And the whole thing here is so much of what I get from this audience in particular. It is about the individual. There's a commonality, but that commonality a lot is about everybody being encouraged to be themselves. We do a lot of our work at Highcroft at University Women's Club, and one of the women there once said to me that I was the most adamant feminist she knew, and I said, I'm not a feminist. I'm really a humanist, really, if that means everyone should be encouraged to live up to their fullest potential, regardless of gender or ethnicity or height or weight or or baldness, any of those things. Because yeah, really. Speaking of clan identity here. Levi, yeah. But the truth is, everybody has value. I've had people in my family who have handicaps of various kinds. They're still productive people. They learned how to do something that worked well. I had a cousin who's dead now, but he had Down syndrome, and he worked in a handicap workshop in Chilliwack. And when he died, someone mentioned to me that at the workshop, he was known as the conciliator, because whenever anybody else had a fight, he was the one who tried to make peace. But truly, that was one of his values. I'm sorry.
I was just curious what you think the future of textiles is going to be and where the development of those is headed.
Sorry, I don't mean to roll my eyes like that, but the truth is I know about the past, I don't know about the present or the future. Well, if you are a fan of science fiction, apparently in the future we are all going to wear the same thing. We're all going to be wearing body stockings of some sort of uniform, or we're going to be wearing animal pelts and carry clubs again. There are the two clans that will develop. The thing about fashion is it is planned obsolescence, and those fashionistas in the room, I apologize, but we talked about this actually beforehand. Traditionally, if you were an extremely wealthy woman in particular, it was true for men to a certain extent. If you were truly wealthy, you changed your wardrobe entirely every 4 months. Every season, you would get a new wardrobe. And that was about being rich and about showing off. It was for women, primarily, actually, to show off the family wealth, the social position of the husband. But to be fair at the same time, you have to keep in mind, in those traditions, we're talking 19th century and early 20th century, and earlier, of course, the tradition was, the respectable tradition was, that only the male family member of the household could work outside the home for money. It was inappropriate for women to work outside the home. I remember my father saying, "No wife of mine is going to work." Well, the rent then came due. My mother went to work. So, anyway, the future of clothing, a suspicion. Tattoos are everywhere now, absolutely hugely popular. I speculate, because fashion is always about actions and reactions. Women's clothing in the future could conceivably cover you from here to there to the ankle. Because when those tattoos become obsolete and are seen as ludicrously old-fashioned, it's like, you know what a skullet is? A skullet is a guy who's still wearing a mullet, but he's gone bald. He still thinks it's the 1970s, and he doesn't look in the mirror. Come on, get real. So it might be that in the future, clothing becomes remarkably conservative. Who knows? But that's part of the fun of fashion, of course, is that it's whimsical. Yes, I'm sorry.
I was interested to hear that you said that both women who owned these outfits came from Winnipeg originally.
Isn't that interesting? Yes.
And I thought that sort of led me to believe, to a question as someone from Winnipeg who has shopped in the thrift stores there. Is there something to locations or to people from specific locations that make it easier to acquire, rich historied garments, or is it just luck of the draw?
It is the luck of the draw. Fashion is anywhere there is a fashionable population. One of my incentives when I shop for clothing is to look for highly fashionable clothing from what to us is obscure places. So I have remarkable clothes from places like Karachi, Pakistan, from the 1930s. I have a dress from 1912 from Cairo, but it's not a folk costume. It is high fashion. And I think it's good for people to see those things. It startles them. When Klaus and I did an exhibition for the Museum of Vancouver called Belle Époque, Women's Clothing of the Belle Époque, which is 1890 to the beginning of the First World War, and this was probably 10 or 15 years ago now, we had fabulous Edwardian dresses, like that pink one there, from 16 different countries. And we did that on purpose because our community has people from all over the world. And when we're standing there sort of hidden in a corner in the gallery, and someone from some place like Nicaragua comes in and says, "That's where I'm from," they love us. Absolutely. And that also means they will read every label in the gallery, and they will learn something. One of the women who models for me sometimes took her husband to that exhibition that we heard of earlier, From Rationing to Ravishing, clothing of the 40s and 50s. And she was ready to go after they'd toured the exhibition. He wouldn't leave because he hadn't read all the labels. We got a comment in our comment book. We always put a comment book out so we know what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. And some guy wrote in and he said, as an upper middle class, I forget what the other adjectives were, but an upper middle class, well-educated man, I would wear any one of these dresses. It was a joke, but he wrote it because he wanted us to pay attention to what he said, which meant, I love this exhibition. And that's important because he's the one that isn't going to just walk in and like it. So you want to get everybody in because you've got a message. You've got a message. Every exhibition should have essentially some sort of meaning to it. We had one case in that exhibition that we glazed in because it had to do with racism during the Second World War, and we knew that if anyone got emotionally upset, that would be the display that people would want to vandalize. We had a dress that had been worn by a woman who was half Japanese and half Scottish in the Japanese concentration camp in Shanghai. We had another dress that was from Germany that had a label in it that is marked Adefa. And Adefa, A-D-E-F-A, is an anagram for a phrase in German that says, guaranteed to be made by Aryan workers, which meant no Jew had ever touched your dress. That's nasty. But we knew that was one of the things that had to be protected, ironically. But the truth is that that's what you can do with old clothes, you see. You can tell stories. You can talk about history. And I'm talking about political history and some of these more social kinds of things. But there's also political history. There is technological history. Who made the fabric? Where was it woven? Who invented the machinery? Who spun the thread? The importance of the sewing machine when it came into being, because what it did, essentially, is it provided women all over the world with a source of income. It was hugely important. I was trying to think of things and clever things to tell you today, and this is not my element. I have to have the clothes or I have nothing to say. Well. But, all these little anecdotes. My parents, as I mentioned, in passing, were officers in the Salvation Army. When the Salvation Army was working in India, they were trying to recruit people, of course. That's the issue with so many of the Christian religions. They're always recruiting. The Salvation Army is a little bit more down to earth and making sure that people are fed and clothed and things like that. The Salvation Army, the concept was to go for the people nobody else would be bothered with. So in India, they were hoping to convert the women who were prostitutes. And this was the bottom rung of society in Indian culture. And they published books on lace making. I bought one from a guy on the island, actually. That's why it sort of came to mind last night. They actually published books on making lace so they could provide those women with a skill that would keep them off the streets. It's a bit goofy nowadays, but at the time that was a very practical thing to do because lace was a hugely valuable commodity. Have I got time? Okay, nice little lace story for you then. I tell people stories that they can use at cocktail parties when they're trying to get rid of someone. It works beautifully for me, apparently. I'm usually the guy in the corner. When can I go home? When can I go home? During the Napoleonic Wars, the borders in Europe changed radically all the time. There'd be another battle and the border would shift and so on and so forth. And this caused a great deal of trouble for the lace industry in Northern Europe. What would happen is a retailer in one city would want to get his lace supplied from a friend in another city. So he would go for a walk through the battlefields with his dog. He'd go and visit the guy at the next village, leave his dog, and go home. The guy in the next village would take the lace that his people had made, wind it around the body of the dog, and put a piece of fur over it, and let the dog go home. And that's how they smuggled the lace across the borders. Do not try that. I'm sorry, there was one question?
Nope, we're gonna save that. Send it, put it online.
Just how do you keep up with
I've lost control of my room.
how do you keep up with exhibitions and whatnot, the events that you're putting on?
I drink. I'm worrying about it, actually. But no, I'm 71.
You mean like in his as he's getting older? How to keep up with it? Is that what you mean? How do we keep up
How
with?
do I keep up? Because I'm old. There is a website. I don't have a computer. I don't have a cell phone. I don't have television. So we'll get that out of the way right away.
It's true.
But one of my friends has created a website called ivansayersevents.com.
Really?
So they will list.
Why didn't somebody tell me this?
Because nobody tells you anything.
No, they don't, Ivan.
You work with the wrong people.
Yeah.
But the truth is, they're only listed for the next 3 months, and if they're sold out, we don't put them up. But we're doing another one of the African charities on November the 5th, I know that, for a surgeon working in Uganda, I think she is this time. But we do a lot of fundraising for various, mostly medical charities. We do pads at least once a year.
So we'll check out the website.
Doing charitable things, being a volunteer is the most selfish thing you can possibly do.
Yep.
So try it out. You will love it. You feel taller and cleaner every time you do it.
Well,
a little bit. It justifies your
I feel
vices.
fat and short and sweaty right now. You know what I love about today's material, Ivan? It's that, like, when you think about the theme, creativity and pioneer, it comes to mind that throughout history, every human being has been a pioneer in their own life, and the way that they've expressed their identity and created the stories of their lives. Those are all moments of breakthrough. Those are all moments of creative expression. And you, my friend, are our local pioneer of fashion history. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.